Good evening, a very warm welcome to this edition of Rush Hour. It's a truncated work week. We're on Wednesday, the 5th of April, 2023. And here we are with the rush of news and updates at the top of the evening on ET Now. Our focus up front is global news, and that brings us to Donald Trump, the former US president facing criminal charges. That's our top story. Criminal is the attorney who is prosecuting me, and the judge presiding over my case hates me. That's what we've heard from Donald Trump. The US elections were rigged, he says, and Democrats are out there to get me. It's the gist, really, of Donald Trump's speech after he became the first US president, sitting or former, to be indicted. In fact, the judge presiding over the case asked Mr. Trump not to make any statement that could incite violence. Nonetheless, we want to today understand why a defendant could accuse the judiciary of political bias in the United States and how the system is different than what we have here in India. But first, let's just listen in to what Trump had to say about it.
I never thought anything like this could happen in America. Never thought it could happen. The only crime that I have committed is to fearlessly defend our nation from those who seek to destroy it. From the beginning, the Democrats spied on my campaign. Remember that? They attacked me with an onslaught of fraudulent investigations. Russia, Russia, Russia. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Impeachment hoax number one. Impeachment hoax number two. The illegal and unconstitutional raid on Mar-a-Lago, right here. This is a persecution, not an investigation. She's put our family through hell. It's cost hundreds of millions of dollars to defend. But our heads are held very, very high. They want to settle the case, but I want no part of that. But now we're there. Spent time there today, as you possibly read, with a local failed district attorney charging a former president of the United States for the first time in history.
And joining us to decode Trump's statements that he made today at Mar-a-Lago, the statements he made to the media from his home in Florida, and also an assessment of the political scenario as it stands in the United States, we have Senior Advocate of the Supreme Court, Sanjay Hegde, joining us, along with the former Ambassador, Suresh Goel. Great to have you both with us, gentlemen. First to you, Mr. Hegde, as far as what the US president, the former US president, is saying, this is about his indictment, but he's turned it into an indictment of the US judiciary. He's saying the judiciary in the US is politicized, and he says it is a witch hunt against him. Do you believe that the US judiciary is politicized like Trump would have us believe?
Well, the judiciary is a much more political institution in the US than it is in India. Sometimes judges get elected, sometimes presidents make appointments to the Supreme Court and they change the complexion of the Supreme Court. Prosecutors and district attorneys also get elected. So the fact is that the judicial system has a certain level of politics in it. But nevertheless, there are inbuilt safeguards. What has happened today is that the material that the prosecutor has, which is in the form of an indictment, has been approved by the grand jury. And thereafter, Mr. Trump has been summoned before the court to enter his plea of guilty or not guilty. Once he pleads not guilty, the matter can go to trial unless, in the meanwhile, his attorneys reach an agreement with the prosecutors over plea bargain. But that's well in the future. Right now, I believe a tentative date for trial has been set in around January next year.
Self could be a long one, but at this point in time where politics is going to become even stronger as we move towards the 2024 presidential elections, Mr. Goel, what do you understand by what Mr. Trump is saying right now? Because he's talking about the judiciary, he's talking about this witch hunt, he's saying the US is going to hell. He's spoken about the US economy being in tatters, and he's saying this is the worst place that the US has been in under President Joe Biden. As far as his chances now to get a Republican nomination, are these criminal charges against him going to bolster his cause, or do you think he's making it worse by making statements the kind he has?
What has happened so far is actually a playbook playbook phenomenon happening in the US judicial courts. There was an indictment of former President Trump on the charges of payment for sex, and it's a minor disciplinary charges on the management of the election funds. Now, not all the evidence that President Trump has, former President Trump has, or what actually the state has, not all the evidence has come into the open besides the public statements, really. Therefore, it is going to be very difficult to say whether eventually Trump will stand convicted of the charges or he will be a free man. The fact is, if he is convicted, then of course his chances of getting a Republican nomination are zero. He will be a convicted man. Of course, he will be able to apply to appeal, etc., and the case will go for a long time. But till the case is decided, he will not be able to get the Republican nomination. But if he is not convicted, if, for example, evidence is not firm enough, etc., and the court decides that the conviction is not the course here, in that case, technically and politically, he will be free to get a Republican nomination again. But politically, I'm convinced that he will be a much weaker candidate. Because in my mind, having lived there for several years, I see the American people, despite all appearances, as being conservative in their approach to these issues. Please remember the case of President Clinton. Again, the same thing happened, not the same thing, but similar thing happened there. And he was convicted in the minds of people on charges of a sexual offense or a sexual misdemeanor. I think in this particular case, so the morality of what he did would weigh uppermost in people. And therefore, after the initial hoo-halla, his case was Vikram.
Absolutely. Mr. Hegde, as far as the judicial system in the US is concerned, the spotlight is clearly on it now in this high-profile case. In terms of a comparison between high-profile cases, the kind that we are saying in the US, and how that's likely to play out in a similar context in India, do you see stark differences?
Well, there are stark differences. Obviously, Mr. Trump has appealed to his Republican base, and especially the Make America Great Again crowd, that this is a witch hunt. And because that forms the core of the Republican Party currently, it is quite likely that this kind of indictment will consolidate his base and might give him the Republican nomination. But in a general election, what Mr. Goyal says is more likely to prevail. An indicted man being elected president and then possibly being subject to a conviction after that, the system may not be able to tolerate it, and people are much more conservative when it comes to actually voting for the president. Voting for a nominee of a party, that's a different thing. If I were to give you an Indian example, we did not have an indictment or a charge sheet, but the current prime minister, there were charges against him. There was an investigation pending. But notwithstanding that, once the Supreme Court said no, there is nothing to order a further investigation. If you think that something is due, please go back to the magistrate's court. That did not prevent the prime minister from getting elected, and he's been re-elected. So how the public responds to pending legal proceedings depends also on the stage of the proceedings and the seriousness with which it is prosecuted.
That's right. And as this case pans out, Mr. Goyal, and as it kind of creates more of a political frenzy across the United States that the world watches, do tell us what you make of the other statements that Mr. Trump has made. He's known to make these caustic remarks, but he has said that the world, as far as the New World Order is concerned, he says the US is losing ground. The US dollar has weakened tremendously. He speaks about the economy, and he talks about inflation going out of hand. Many of these points do hold true, and we do discuss this. But at a time like this, when Trump points out the failures of the Biden administration in the run-up to the 2024 US presidential elections, how much meaning, how much is it going to serve his cause, in your opinion?
I think it's too early to say all that. If you recall the elections of Trump to the presidency, even before his nomination was announced, the economy was solidly behind Obama, if you recall. It began to fluctuate after his nomination was announced. He basically strengthened, he firmed up his grounds as he approached the elections. So therefore, I would say that it's too early to say whether what is happening now in the US markets is going to play up or what will happen later on. But what I do believe is that in the case of Trump, there were heavy inter-party rivalries and the differences which actually worked against him, with the exception of the super nationalists. There were hardly anybody who actually was supporting Trump. And even after elections, he tried to play havoc with the results of the election. And now, I would say two things here. It's very, very difficult to say anything with any great certainty as to how it is going to pan out. The world situation depends not just on the US election, but the world economic situation would depend upon so many other factors. COVID is coming up again. The European economy is weak. Ukraine war is going on. How it's going to play out? There are so many factors. I wouldn't even dare go into any firm forecast, number one. Number two, and I think that is not really related to how the world economy is going to perform, but maybe just a kind of an appeal, or maybe you see, the point really is, will Trump's election or non-election make an impact on India? And I don't think, considering the fact that the India-US elections have bipartisan support, you remember Trump at one time claimed that he is heavily in favor of relations with India, but Biden has not done too. Therefore, we should not link up our relations with USA to who comes as the president. And rather than making a bad statement about any candidate, it is better not to make any statement. Victor.
Fair enough. Yes, absolutely. We keep watching the situation, as many moving pieces there are right now all across the world, and that is going to have a telling effect, and this is one important piece as well. But Mr. Hegde and Mr. Goyal, thank you very much for joining us with your perspective, and that's the big news that we are tracking today. The former US president has been charged. He's been charged with 34 counts of falsifying business records, and he has pleaded not guilty to all the charges that have been leveled against him, and some big statements have been made at his Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida. The word coming in from Donald Trump himself about the criminal charges leveled against him.